Good afternoon. I want to thank my beloved Morehouse brother and Garrett brother. We actually studied together at Garrett while I was pastoring in Chicago. This is a surreal moment for me because Dr. Roberts is here, and I was actually pastoring at Varick AME Zion Church in New Haven and a student at Yale Divinity School when you were there. So I can verify he's telling the truth. But he's also been a great inspiration to me. Your work is all in my book, Dr. Roberts, and I am honored to be in your presence today. And I'm so proud of Johnny Hill and the work that he is doing, and he's right on target, and I can't wait to get a copy of Prophetic Rage. I can't wait. Johnny said he can't wait to get a copy either. It worked out well that Eerdmans Publishers pushed it up so that we could get our hands on this book. And I think, as has already been mentioned, that we cannot afford to operate in silos any longer in these enclosed disciplines. It has to be a united effort of solidarity of mind and heart and body in order to bring about real justice and freedom for our people. And so I'm going to be using your book as much as I use my book. And I think we have to be in dialogue. We shared lunch today with our other Morehouse brother, Dr. Raphael Warnock, and his great book that has come out, The Divided Mind of the Black Church. Yes. I think all of these can be read in tandem, in concert, to help our people. My concerns as a doctor of the church have to do with theology and ethics and pastoral care. I happen to pastor the Pennsylvania Avenue AME Zion Church here in the city of Baltimore, a very historic congregation in the city, and I've been a pastor in the AME Zion Church for the better part of 27 years. And I feel like I've been in school all my life too. So I've been trying to negotiate and reconcile these perceived differences between the church and the academy. And of course, I'm preaching to the choir here, but Dr. Roberts helped us, and Dr. Cohn and others, to see that there is a divide that doesn't need to be there between the black church, black theology, and the black church. And my abiding concern is to build a bridge there. I'm not the first. I'm in a long line of people who have tried to build this bridge, and I know that Dr. Roberts and others have sought to keep the academy true to the church and the church true to the academy. However, my real concern in the book, in addition to building that bridge, is what has been rightly identified as a divide between the black church and its own community. The black church has become an alien in its own land. The critique now is not just coming from the academy, but the critique is coming from the black community itself about the lack of responsiveness and moral authority and courage of the black church. And so in my conversation, our conversation with Johnny Hill's great work is how do we resist the urge of the prophetic rage being only the rage of the talented tenth? Right? I mean, this really has to be about our people. And if black preachers and black leaders are not really concerned about the people they're supposed to be leading, how can you be authentic and genuine as a church? Have we become a church of the well-heeled and the well-connected? Are our concerns more middle class? Or are they really connected to the poor and the working class people who make up our congregations? For instance, in the city of Baltimore, and Baltimore's history has been well chronicled with shows like The Corner and Homicide and The Wire. Yeah. In fact, my church is right in the neighborhood where The Wire was filmed, many other parts of the city of Baltimore. In other words, I pastor in the hood in Baltimore. Pennsylvania Avenue is the hood by all stretch of the imagination. The neighborhood that I serve in, the Upton neighborhood, by all accounts has the worst socioeconomic indices of the entire city of Baltimore. And how can I be faithful as a pastor if I never address those issues? If I'm not connected to the people? One of my favorite quotes by Dr. King, and this is the abridged version of his quote, is any religion that professes to be concerned about the soul but is unconcerned about the conditions that damage the soul is a dry as dust religion. So how can we, how dare we come into church and preach and shout and sing ourselves happy and not deal with the reality of what Carol Watkins Ali calls genocidal poverty? And that's really what it is. So my book is entitled, here's what it looks like, Standing on Holy Common Ground. The subtitle of it is An Afrocentric Ministry Approach to Prophetic Community Engagement. So my concern is to call the church back home in order to get home, if that makes any sense. So I want to read a couple of excerpts from the book, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions and be a part, more importantly for me, to be a part of this ongoing dialogue. One of the keys to restoring African American communities is an indigenous cultural and spiritual reconnection with the Black church and vice versa. In order for the connection to be authentic, it has to be more than transactional, political or economic. The connection has to be anchored in the recovery of a holy common ground. So that's my motif, Johnny, a holy common ground. At the center of this holy common ground is a truly African spiritual ethos. While many churches have made the overt attempt to infuse Afrocentrism, some use the term Afrocentrism, most have been drawn to the current evangelical trends that tend to deculturalize and decolorize the gospel. There appears to be a direct correlation between racial, social integration, and the de-radicalization of the Black church, which Dr. Gayward Wilmore refers to as, quote, the process of lessening social and political advocacy of Black ministers and churches in urban areas, end of quote. The diminishing concern for liberation and social change is a result of the increasing conservatism of the modern evangelical movement adopted by many Black churches. Many Black churches have eliminated overtly African or African American symbols, themes, language, or images in the interest of becoming non-racial, post-racial, or multicultural in the age of Obama. James Cone, largely considered one of the fathers of Black theology, gives a piercing assessment of the state of the Black church. You remember his volume, For My People. I like this quote where he says, without a clearly articulated theological position in creeds and theological textbooks, Black preachers and their members have nowhere else to turn for theological knowledge and spiritual renewal except conservative, white evangelical churches. Of course, some Black preachers and laypersons can and do transcend white theology and spirituality, but unfortunately, most do not know how to distinguish between Black faith and white religion. Wow. And with the appearance of electronic church on radio and television, Black Christians are being lured from their spiritual heritage in Black churches to the false gods of the Jerry Falwells of this world. Without a critical Black theology, Black preachers are left with the option of simply imitating the false gods of the electronic church in order to keep their congregations from deserting the 11 a.m. service and other activities of their churches, close quote. The Black church, in my estimation, needs a spiritual, ideological, and theological grounding that is true to its African roots. However, praxis, the practical application or theory, and a reflexive, active interchange is most important for the survival and liberation of African American communities. The early beginnings of the Black church were explicitly African-centered, as well as Christocentric. Dr. J. Diotis Roberts explores the meaning of Afrocentric Christianity in his comprehensive work on the subject, and I quote Dr. Roberts. Afrocentrism is more than wearing African garments or dancing to percussive African music. It involves more than a cultural revival. It requires a new perspective of life, a cultural conversion. It leads to a new life view and worldview for African peoples. Afrocentrism builds upon the self-respect and empowerment aspects of the Black consciousness, Black power movement. The emphasis on Blackness that gave rise to Black studies and Black theology. Afrocentric leaders give due credit to the contributions of persons such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Unlike the Black Power movement, Afrocentrism seeks to interpret our history and reconstruct our culture. It does not rest with slavery or with our ancestry in West Africa. It takes us back to classical African history in Ethiopia and especially Egypt, close quote. I raised the question, how does the Black church recover its primary cultural and spiritual resource? How does she reconcile her strained and sometimes estranged relationship with increasingly secular African American neighborhoods? How does she lead the restoration of dispirited, depleted, disenfranchised, and disinvested urban communities? The answer can be found in the many successful models of responsible congregations that have become cultural and spiritual reservoirs of empowerment, advocating and partnering with communities to create an oasis in the middle of urban deserts of blight and depravity. The mission of transforming African American communities in inner cities must involve recapturing our African spirituality in a contemporary context. This is a twofold venture. On the one hand, it involves reconciling the ruptured relationship between the Black church and the Black community. And on the other hand, it involves a restoring a sense of communality that is central to African and African American identity. Reconciliation must first involve acknowledgement of a fault and or violation of the relationship before forgiveness and resolution can occur. We can take a note from South Africa in that regard. In this sense, the Black church can be prophetic and calling out the sin of its own negligence and apathy toward the suffering of the Black community, as well as assess the historical, political, and economic forces that have directly and indirectly damaged Black neighborhoods. The Black church can also be priestly and bringing about healing and reconciliation by extending compassion and concern for the well-being of the victimized and the vulnerable. I would dare say before we can get to Black rage, we need to get to some Black healing. The bridge between the divide that appears to exist between the Black church and the African American community must begin with the recovery of African communality, which is central to Afrocentric Christianity. As Dr. Lee Butler, professor at Chicago Theological Seminary, points out, quote, most Africans think first and foremost in terms of the good of the group, that is, the community. They secondly think of themselves, but only as individuals related to a group, close quote. Butler goes on to describe the interrelatedness of all things in African communality. The highest community value is cooperation. Each one's sense of self is related to a collective self. Quote, an individual life is given meaning only when within the context of the life of the whole community. End of quote. Every action of the individual has consequences for the entire community. These actions and consequences in African communality are all a part of the sacred world. This is very different, if not diametrically opposed, to the Western worldview that separates and demarcates between the sacred and the secular. As Butler states, quote, one of the leading paradigms of Western culture has been the separation of the sacred and the secular. Unfortunately, African America, as a culture of the West, has also succumbed to the splitting practices of the West. There was a time when it was clearly understood that the church did not simply have its finger on the pulse of the community, rather the church was the pulsating life force of the community. Yet somewhere in our history, our spirituality transgressed into a segregated worldview by splitting religiosity from social action. It seems as if we have broken continuity with African spirituality and declared there is a separation between the sacred and secular. Delilah discovered our strength and our thick hair of communality and shaved it from our heads. What was once conceived as a unified whole has been separated into the split personalities of church and community. One of the results of that separation has been a marginalization of the church, which has increased human alienation. The church has traditionally been the place that helped us find rest from wandering. In it, we have been able to find home. It has been our place to find acceptance, respect, and family. If the church is pushed to the margins, then the possibility of our finding an end to our wandering is decreased. Human alienation and homelessness are increased if the church remains separate from the community. Close quote. In the context of this African communality, which was transported across the Atlantic in the minds and hearts of our African forebears, the Black church inherited and propagated what Gayward Wilmore refers to as a threefold strategy for the African American community: survival, elevation, and liberation. These three motifs were performed both successively and simultaneously throughout the history of the Black community. I'm going to skip to this last section, the substance of things hoped for. Restoring the historic integral connection of the Black church and the African American community is both a theological and missional goal. The proponents of Black theology would argue that they are one in the same. At its heart, Black theology is practical, and its ultimate aim is liberation of the oppressed. The subjects and objects of liberation are people who live in communities that have been marginalized by racial, political, and economic injustice. This has been the historical role of the Black church, which is located almost exclusively and predominantly African American neighborhoods. However, that role has been diminished by the continuing confluence of religious and social assimilation in post-civil rights American society, and institutional self-preservation and apathy in the Black church. Many Black churches have fallen short in their commitment to liberation and social change. The truth is that Black theology would not exist without the Black church. And as a product of the mission of the Black church, a unique pastoral theology emerged to enable the dual roles of survival and liberation for African American people. Carol Watkins Ali describes both as necessary functions of pastoral theology, and I won't go into that. Let me fast forward. The current context for African Americans has been described by Watkins Ali as genocidal poverty. It is the kind of living conditions that are responsible for the growing death rate in the Black community. Although poverty is not normally listed as a cause of death, the malnutrition, fetal demise, untreated disease due to lack of or poor health care, homicide, fratricide, suicide, alcohol, and drug abuse that are becoming prevalent in poor Black communities all contribute to the gradual form of genocide that has been integral to the systematic racial oppression of Black folk. The Black church, especially in urban areas, must begin to work towards alleviating and eradicating this persistent condition. It will require a recovery of an African-centered theology that is practical and intentional. This cannot happen without progressive and responsible leadership, especially from theologian practitioners. The 21st century Black church should recognize that our current social location is not a matter of theology, but sociology, precipitated by racial and social injustice. The resurgence of the prophetic Black church of the past will be initiated and activated by a recovery of the African spirituality that shaped the original Black church in America. Peter Paris, that Dr. Hill referred to, identified 6 moral virtues of African and African American churches that promote community and appear to be preeminent in both. They are namely beneficence. The beneficent person is a person of goodwill, one who joyfully extends hospitality to all alike, respecting all persons. Secondly, forbearance. This is a patient tolerance to do what is necessary to preserve life under caustic conditions. 3, practical wisdom. This is an excellence of that thought that guides good action. It is fully developed capacity of a free moral agent for acting responsible judgments about the best means for the attainment of penultimate goals, as well as the determination of their commensurability with the ultimate goal of the good life. Improvisation, fourthly, this brings novelty to bear on the familiar, not for the sake of destroying the latter, but for the purpose of heightening the individuality and uniqueness of the agent in his or her creative ability. 5, forgiveness. This rebukes the toll that hatred can exact by cultivating the habitual exercise of kindness for the sake of the community, and 6, justice. This is realized in 2 ways: the individual's obligations to the community as mediated through the many dealing individuals have with one another, and the community's obligations to its members and itself. Finally, an African-centered spirituality is best suited to the Black Church's goals of reconciling and restoring the African American community. The moral virtues of the culture and adapted principles of Nguzo Saba are the effectual ingredients of a redeemed and revitalized community. Considering the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the product of the Black church and the African American community, it is no wonder that his vision of a beloved community incorporated implicitly and explicitly much of these same characteristics. This indeed provides the foundation for the building of a holy common ground. Amen. I'll stop there and open up for conversation. Any questions? Or yes, sir.
Yeah, again, it's a very profound analysis and treatment of what really is real, and in a sense of what is missing for prophetic movement in the Black church experience. And it seems to me that while there's a construction of the common ground with the Afrocentrism that you elected and referred to, that there needs to be an intentional deconstructive effort toward the blatant classism that is linked with the blessings of God.
Yeah.
And in the same way that we need to learn about what the empire is,
That's right.
and how it affects us daily, it seems in our congregations there needs to be more discussion of what classism is, what it looks like, and then how we so easily not only embrace white religion, but also define God's blessing in light of enjoying the privilege of a classist Christianity. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, I think you're right on it. I think I wasn't at the discussion earlier with Dwight Hopkins, but from what I hear, and Dale Andrews has a book called Black Theology for Black Churches that talks about the same thing, that unfortunately, we drank the Kool-Aid. Right? I mean, that's what's happened to us in America. The grass always looked greener on the other side, and we basically switched places, or we wanted to get at the same table. And Dr. Wosak talked about that last night, the difference between protest and resistance. And I never thought about it that way. That's so profound. He said, protest is really not what we think it is. Protest is really complaining about what's going on, where resistance is about, I don't want to be at the table, I want to change the table. I want to fundamentally change the table. Protest is complaining and murmuring about not being at the table. Why do you want to be at that table? Because you aspire to the same American values.
Right.
Dale Andrews says that in many ways, Black theology misdiagnosed, misunderstood what the power of American individualism, imperialism, and capitalism, and consumerism has had on us. And the Black church is not immune. I mean, most Black preachers want to live well. Can we be real?
Yes.
I mean, that is even more with the preachers in LA and all this other madness that's out there, right? I mean, people see that as the model of success. And so, although there are prophetic voices, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but we're swimming upstream, right? We are in the minority. And the pressures of the symbols of success make it very difficult for us to have the prophetic rage that we need to have. Because especially, and I think Jamie was hinting at this, my friend, I was good friends with President Obama when I pastored in Chicago, and it's very hard to criticize a Black man in the White House. We're so happy he's there, right? But the reality is he has become a part of the same system that has been built against the minority, namely poor people and powerless people. I mean, he's become a part of the system. And I think he did have great intentions. I mean, knowing him and hearing, we were swept up with the rhetoric of his campaign because it sounded like a new day was a coming. But as soon as you occupy that seat, you become a part of that system. And how can you criticize it, especially when a black man is sitting there? But we have to have that prophetic rage. But it has to be precipitated by the kind of analysis that I think Johnny Hill is talking about. And how do we do that with our people and still give them some low-hanging fruit so that it doesn't become so theological, so dense that our people can't get it? What's the reality? I mean, black folks, for us, when I talk about Afrocentrism, and people automatically put up a resistance when you say Afrocentric because they think you're talking pro-black at the exclusion of other people. Afrocentrism has nothing to do with phenotypical skills or symbols. It has to do with a state of mind, right? That's about community. I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. When I came up in the church, I used to hear statements like, there are no big I's and no little U's. Y'all remember hearing that in the church?
No, you're right.
But we don't really believe that. We say it, but we don't really believe it. Because we got a whole lot of big I's.
Yeah, Lord.
And HNICs and all that. I'm sorry, Dr.
The thing that I was wondering about, and it's all exciting, very, very exciting. Thank you, sure.
Thank you.
The thing that I was curious about is that, since you are in the midst of pastoring and theorizing, I was wondering if there is a kind of openness within ministerial communities to do this kind of theological reflection and analysis, not only for leaders, but also for the people in which you're trying to care for. Because I find that one of the things that really strikes me is this ideal of conscientization, to help people to begin to kind of think through why I'm in this situation that I'm in, and to give them some opportunities to sort of do this reflection and analysis and it not come from the top. So those are the kinds of things that
Good point. Well, yes, I talk a little bit about that in my book, and you're right on it. My executive assistant is here, and we're right in the midst of a study called Seeking the Welfare of the City. And this is the first time I've done a class like this. It just occurred to me while we were, kind of lamenting what's going on in Baltimore. Baltimore now just set a dubious record of over 200 homicides this year. Not something you want to celebrate, right? But all of the other issues that are going on in the city, and people asking, what does the church have to say about it, right? And so rather than doing the traditional thing of going to the ministers' association meeting and all the other stuff that we do, and talk about the same old stuff, why not talk about going to the grassroots with our people? Now, I think you're hinting at something, it's almost like the elephant in the room, is that whenever you start talking about this stuff, people really don't want to hear it. Right? You can't get a whole lot of people to come to Bible study when you talk about this kind of stuff. Right? Because the Bible study they want to go to is Joel Osteen's My Best Life Now.
Oh, Lord.
Right? Or, maximize your life.
Yeah.
Reposition yourself. Right? That's the Bible study everybody wants to go to, right? They don't want to talk about this stuff. Right? But you got to make the bold moves, and you got to find, I must admit that I'm somewhat in uncharted territory, and that I'm trying to find something, like, remember when you were sick and Mama talked about castor oil, and the only way she can get you to take it is if she sweetened it, right? So in some ways, pastors have to sweeten it to get people to take it, right? So we can have the conversation. So I'm trying gingerly to get in that water with people so that we start to see the connection to our lived experiences, because they were built in these burgeoning urban areas that have now changed, right? So what was once a middle-class, comfortable community is now hard, gritty, urban ghetto, and the church don't want to deal with those kind of people. Yes, today.
Dr. McCorn, I think you did a very good job of fusing when you use African-centered, Afrocentrism in your book. There's a difference in the paradigm.
Okay.
So how do you spell that out within your book when you have people who use Afrocentrism in a different paradigm and African in a different paradigm? And you do it good, but how, if people were to read your book, does it spell that out so that they understand the difference?
Yeah, I don't think I do such a good job at that, to be honest with you. I think it is difficult for us to think that way because we have been led to believe that Afrocentric has to do with more style, than content, right? I think African-centered does get at it a little bit better. When you talk about starting at Africa, that's your starting point. Historically, theologically, economically, I mean, it's a little easier to do that. That I do regret. I remember going back and forth. You know, my doctoral advisor was Ivan Hicks, who did a PhD under Malifi and Sante at Temple. And we would go back and forth about that whole thing and how we really frame that and talk about it. But I think that there's enough in here to get the conversation on the same, same playing field, singing from the same playbook, so people understand that there are cultural values and ethics that are associated with Afrocentrism that we ought to promote, adopt, and then promote. Brother Johnny?
I just want to say thank you so much for this very creative work. I mean, I think it's groundbreaking and it's prophetic in the sense that it actually gives us a way of thinking about actually how to engage churches in the process of the task of liberation in local communities. So for instance, this piece that you lifted up on recapturing African spirituality. Could you say more about what you mean by African spirituality and how it may connect with this renewed Pentecostalism that's at work in churches across the country? So is there a way, and there's a lot of conversation about Pentecostalism and holiness movement and all these kinds of things, but on a concrete level, is there a way to have a dialogue or create sort of a conversation between African spirituality and this sort of pseudo-Pentecostalism that's at work in many churches? How, in a way that can be liberative and transformative?
Wow.
Like, can we provide, is there a way to provide language for those who are concerned with the movement of the Spirit and the activity of the Spirit, those who love the work and, power and praise and all of these sorts of things, that is connected to recapturing the African Spirit?
Right, good. Wow, that's a great point. I'm sure others can add to this, but I remember one way to approach it is this saying that I've heard, and I'm sure I've used it in my sermon, is that it's not how high you jump, but it's how straight you walk when you come back down. Right? So people have a tendency to get caught up in the euphoria and emotionalism, which we have to embrace as not altogether bad. I think we always compare ourselves to what we consider to be the white models, which are inherently superior. So it's this whole crazy bifurcation between the intellectual and the spiritual. For Africans, there's no difference between that. It's all the same. So when you talk about African spirituality, you're not just talking about emotionalism, right? African spirituality is head and heart. I think Howard Thurman talked about that, right? Head and heart. African spirituality is connected to community. So we do that together. That I cannot be religious by myself, which I think in many ways separates Christianity from some other religions, and that Christianity ought to be. It's not just piety, it's about community. That you are a Christian because you're in relationship with other Christians and with the wider world. So in my understanding of, Pentecostalism is more than just the emotion of a moment when the Spirit falls, but Pentecostal is what I live every day. If I'm guided by the Spirit, because I actually talk about it in my book, the power of Acts chapter 2, when the Holy Spirit fell in Acts chapter 2, the thing that they were most amazed about is not that they were speaking in tongues. What made it so phenomenal is that everybody had all things in common. That's what scared people. Folk looked at it and said, who are these people? We think it's the emotional glossolalia and all that. It was much more than that. It was a total reordering of community. They began to live a different life. And to me, that's Pentecostal life. Right? I'm a good Methodist. Right? And we always say that holiness is a way of life. Holiness is not a denomination. It's not what happens in church. Holiness is what you do every day. So I think our African, we tend to probably romanticize Africa more, but at its very heart, if you pull together all of the African religions, African traditional religions, and the way people live, you can find some common threads. Peter Paris talks about it. And there is a sense of spirituality that is not bifurcated between the sacred and the secular. It's all one. Yeah, Dr. Roberts.
First of all, from
Yeah, okay.
Cedric Kierkegaard, you live life looking forward, go forward in life by looking backwards. And that's part of what we're talking about, going back to our roots.
Yes,
and then
sir.
looking forward from that.
Yes, sir.
But I'm thinking about the experience I had in Mexico City, with ordinary people, just poor people, interpreting the Bible. And all of our people love the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So all of my study and teaching had indicated that Jonah was led by water, in a direction that he didn't want to go. And I was thinking about all the information I had with me about internationalism and all of that. And this lady, just an ordinary woman, poor woman, said, suppose Jonah had been in the belly of the wheel, and existentialism and all that came to mind. But she had none of that knowledge.
Wow.
But suppose Jonah had been in the belly of the whale. And that gave a message to me that I never thought about.
Yep.
And so we can learn from people.
Yes,
There's
sir.
ordinary people who live in ordinary life. And we've been to seminary and all that, university. But they know more than we do.
Yes, sir.
We should learn from them.
I tell my folk all the time, Dr. Robinson, I learned more. I started pastoring in the country in Somerville, Georgia. And I tell folk I learned more in that little country church than I learned at Morehouse and Yale combined. Thank you. Thank you, Jay.